A desperate wail pierced the silence of the October night as Abigail Jensen clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The weathered barn outside Piach, Nevada offered little protection from the biting autumn chill of 1876, but it was all she had after fleeing 3 days ago with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small bundle of necessities, and her precious 6-month-old Emma. The baby's cries echoed through the cavernous space, bouncing off hay bales and worn wooden beams. Abigail rocked her gently, glancing nervously at the barn door with each creak and groan of the structure. "Hush now, sweet girl," she whispered, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We must be quiet." She pressed her cracked lips to Emma's forehead, alarmed by the unusual warmth she felt there. The fever that had started that morning was getting worse, and Abigail had nothing to treat it with, her stomach twisted with hunger and fear. They hadn't eaten properly in days, and her milk was diminishing. How much longer could they survive like this? The question haunted her as Emma's wailing intensified. The sudden sound of approaching hoofbeats sent ice through Abigail's veins. She scrambled deeper into the shadows behind a stack of hay bales, one hand pressed gently over Emma's mouth to muffle her cries. The barn door creaked open, allowing a shaft of moonlight to pierce the darkness. "Hello," a deep voice called out. "I know someone's in here." Abigail held her breath, trying to make herself invisible in the shadows. Her escape from San Francisco from her husband's brutal hands couldn't end like this. "I ain't going to hurt you," the voice continued, softer now. "My name's Patrick Irwin. This is my property." The footsteps drew closer, boots crunching on scattered hay. Emma squirmed in Abigail's arms, her little face red with fever and discomfort. "Please," Abigail finally whispered, her voice breaking. "We'll leave at first light. We just needed shelter for the night." A tall figure appeared at the edge of her hiding place. In the dim light, Abigail could make out broad shoulders under a worn duster, a strong jawline shadowed with stubble, and eyes that seemed to catch what little moonlight filtered through the barn's weathered boards. "You've got a child?" he asked, his voice losing its edge when he spotted the bundle in her arms. Abigail nodded, clutching Emma tighter. "My daughter, she's sick. We've been traveling for days." The man, Patrick, crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were kind, not the eyes of someone meaning harm. "You'll both be fed before dawn," he said simply, his voice a low rumble that somehow eased the tightness in Abigail's chest. "The little one needs warmth and medicine, and you look dead on your feet, madam." Abigail hesitated, years of hard lessons making her wary. "Why would you help us?" Patrick stood slowly, replacing his hat. "Because my mother taught me better than to leave a woman and baby to suffer in the cold." He extended a calloused hand. "My ranch house isn't far. There's food, medicine, and a proper bed, no strings attached." Emma's pitiful whimper made the decision for her. Abigail took his hand, her own trembling with exhaustion and fear. "I'm Abigail," she offered, rising unsteadily to her feet. "Abigail Jensen, and this is Emma. Pleased to meet you both, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Patrick's gaze lingered on the infant's flushed face. "How long has she had the fever?" "Since this morning," Abigail said, following him toward the barn entrance. "It's getting worse." Patrick nodded grimly. "My sister had a knack for healing before she moved east, left her remedies behind. Should have something for the little one." Outside, a sturdy chestnut mare waited patiently. Patrick helped Abigail onto the saddle before mounting behind her, one arm securely around her waist to keep her and Emma steady. "Hold tight now," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear as he urged the horse forward. The ride to the ranch house took less than 10 minutes, but to Abigail it felt like an eternity. Emma's fever-hot body pressed against her chest, Patrick's solid presence at her back a strange moment of safety she hadn't experienced in years. The Irwin ranch house appeared as they crested a small rise, a sturdy 2-story structure with light glowing from several windows. It wasn't grand, but it was well maintained, with a wide porch and smoke curling from the stone chimney. Patrick helped her dismount at the front steps, taking Emma from her arms when Abigail's legs threatened to give out beneath her. "Easy now," he murmured, supporting her with his free arm while cradling the baby expertly against his chest. "Let's get you both inside." The warmth of the house enveloped Abigail as they entered, bringing tears to her eyes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across a simple but comfortable living area. The smell of something savory made her stomach clench painfully. "Sit," Patrick instructed, guiding her to an armchair near the fire. "I'll get something for the baby first, then food for you both." Abigail sank into the chair, watching as Patrick laid Emma gently on a soft blanket he spread across the nearby sofa. The baby's cries had subsided to miserable whimpers, her little fists clenched tight. "How long since you've eaten?" Patrick asked, moving to a cabinet where he began examining bottles of various sizes. "Properly, 3 days," Abigail admitted. "I've had scraps, saved what little food I had for Emma." Patrick's movements paused briefly, his shoulders tensing before he resumed his search. "You're running from something, or someone." It wasn't a question, but Abigail felt compelled to answer anyway. "My husband, he's not a good man," Patrick nodded without turning. "Figured as much." He selected a small amber bottle and brought it to Emma, along with a spoon and a cup of water. "This will bring her fever down. My sister swore by it for the children in town." Abigail watched anxiously as he administered a tiny dose to Emma, who protested weakly before swallowing. "Where is your wife?" she asked suddenly, glancing around the well-kept home. "Never married," Patrick replied, rising to his feet. "It's just me here since my parents passed 5 years back. My sister married and moved to Chicago last year." He moved toward the kitchen. "I'll fix you something to eat, the baby too, if she's hungry." While Patrick worked in the kitchen, Abigail tended to Emma, changing her soiled cloth with supplies Patrick had provided and rocking her gently. The medicine seemed to be working already. The baby's skin felt less hot to the touch, and her crying had subsided. Patrick returned with a tray bearing a bowl of stew, freshly baked bread, and a glass of milk. The simple meal looked more appetizing than any fancy dinner Abigail had ever been served as Charles Jensen's wife. "Eat slowly," Patrick advised, setting the tray on a small table beside her chair. "Your stomach won't be used to much after 3 days." Abigail nodded gratefully, taking a spoonful of the rich stew. The flavors brought fresh tears to her eyes, a simple meal prepared by a stranger who asked nothing in return. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. Patrick nodded once, moving to tend the fire. "There's a spare room upstairs, clean sheets on the bed. You and the little one can rest there tonight." "I don't know how to repay you," Abigail said. "Not looking for payment, Mrs. Jensen." "Miss," she corrected quietly. "I left that name behind when I fled." Patrick studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Well then, Miss Abigail, eat your fill and rest. Morning's soon enough to worry about what comes next." That night, lying in the clean, comfortable bed with Emma sleeping peacefully beside her, Abigail stared at the ceiling and wondered what kind of man took in strangers without question. Patrick Irwin was either the most decent person she'd ever encountered, or he had motives she couldn't yet discern. Either way, she decided as sleep finally claimed her, they would be gone by sunrise. She couldn't risk staying any longer, no matter how safe the ranch house felt compared to the cold, dangerous world outside. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through curtains Abigail didn't remember closing. Emma cooed beside her, the fever broken, her tiny hands reaching toward the sunbeams. For a moment, Abigail allowed herself to savor the peace-clean sheets, her healthy child, the smell of coffee and something sweet drifting up from downstairs. Reality intruded quickly. They needed to leave before she became indebted to Patrick Irwin. Before Charles's men tracked them to Piotch, before the tenuous safety shattered like everything else good in her life. She dressed quickly in her dirty traveling clothes, ignoring the clean dress someone Patrick had laid across a chair during the night. Gathering Emma and their meager belongings, she crept down the stairs, hoping to slip away unnoticed. Patrick stood at the bottom of the staircase, as if he'd been waiting for her. He held a mug of coffee in one hand, his expression neutral but his eyes knowing. "Leaving without breakfast?" he asked mildly. Abigail froze, clutching Emma tighter. We've imposed enough. Breakfast isn't an imposition, it's a necessity." Patrick gestured toward the kitchen. "Especially since you're planning to travel with a baby who was feverish last night." "Mr. Irwin, Patrick," he corrected. "Patrick," Abigail amended. "You've been incredibly kind, but we need to move on." "To where?" he challenged gently. "With what money, what plan?" The questions struck Abigail like physical blows. She had no answers. Her hasty escape from San Francisco had left her with almost nothing, just enough to buy passage on the stagecoach to Piotch, a town she'd chosen simply because it was far from California and her husband's influence. "I'll figure something out," she said, lifting her chin defiantly despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. Patrick sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim of his mug. "I'm sure you will. You strike me as a capable woman, Miss Abigail. But perhaps you might figure things out with a full stomach and a plan that doesn't involve dragging that baby back into the cold." Emma chose that moment to gurgle happily, reaching a tiny hand toward Patrick as if in agreement. Despite herself, Abigail felt a smile tug at her lips. "One meal," she conceded. "Then we'll be on our way." Patrick nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Fair enough." Breakfast was hearty fried eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey, and coffee strong enough to fortify Abigail's resolve. Patrick ate quietly across from her, occasionally making silly faces at Emma, who watched him with fascination from her perch on Abigail's lap. "You're good with her," Abigail observed, surprised. "Had 4 younger siblings," Patrick explained, passing Emma a small piece of biscuit to gum. "Helped raise them after our ma took ill." "They're lucky to have had you," Abigail said softly, thinking of her own lonely childhood in a series of boarding schools while her parents traveled. Patrick shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's what family does." He cleared his throat. "Speaking of which, is there family you're heading toward? Someone expecting you?" Abigail shook her head. "My parents died 2 years ago. I have no siblings, no relatives willing to stand against Charles, my husband." The word tasted bitter on her tongue. "He's a powerful man in San Francisco. Banking, railroads, shipping. People don't cross Charles Jensen if they want to prosper." Patrick's expression darkened. "And yet you crossed him?" "I had no choice," Abigail whispered, unconsciously touching a fading bruise at her temple, mostly hidden by her hair. "Not after." Not when Emma came along. Understanding dawned in Patrick's eyes, followed by a flash of anger quickly suppressed. "The baby changed things." "He'd never hurt me where it showed before," Abigail explained, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. "But after Emma was born, something changed in him. The drinking got worse, his temper." She swallowed hard. 3 nights ago, he came home in a rage. He said Emma's crying was driving him mad. He grabbed her from her cradle and..." She couldn't continue. "You don't need to explain," Patrick said quietly, his hand moving across the table as if to comfort her before withdrawing. "You protected your child, that's all that matters." Abigail nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I took what money I could find in his desk, grabbed Emma and a few necessities, and fled while he was passed out. His men will be looking for us. They may have already traced us to Piotch." Patrick considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Piotch isn't the safest place for a woman alone, even without men hunting you. The silver mines bring in rough types. The town's growing, but it's still wild territory." "I don't have many options," Abigail admitted. Patrick seemed to make a decision. "I need help around the ranch," he said carefully. "My sister used to handle the accounts, correspondence, household matters. Since she left, things have gotten disorganized." Abigail blinked in surprise. "Are you offering me employment, room and board for you and Emma? A modest wage. In exchange for keeping the books, managing household affairs, perhaps some light cooking." Patrick's gaze was direct, honest. "No strings attached. You'd have the guest room with a lock on the door if it makes you feel safer. And if your husband's men come sniffing around, well, this land's been in my family for 30 years. I know every hiding place within 20 miles. The offer was unexpected, too good to be true, perhaps." Abigail studied Patrick's face, searching for signs of deception. She found none. "Why would you do this for strangers?" she asked. Patrick stood, gathering their empty plates. "Because you need help and I need help. Seems simple enough to me." He paused, adding more softly, "And because no one should have to face the world alone, especially not with a little one depending on them." Abigail looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep against her chest, tiny fingers curled around a fold of Abigail's dress. Safety, stability. The chance to breathe and plan their future without the constant fear of discovery. 2 weeks, she decided. "I'll stay and work for 2 weeks. That should give me time to figure things out." Patrick nodded, satisfied. 2 weeks it is then. He extended his hand formally, and Abigail shifted Emma to shake it, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and the gentleness of his grip. "Now," he said, releasing her hand, "let me show you around the place you'll be organizing." The Irwin ranch turned out to be larger than Abigail had initially thought. Besides the main house, there was a bunkhouse for the handful of ranch hands Patrick employed, a cookhouse, stables, corrals, and various outbuildings. The operation wasn't enormous by Nevada standards, but it was substantial enough to require significant management. "Most of the men are out with the herd," Patrick explained as they walked the property, Emma bundled warmly against the autumn chill. "We run about 500 head of cattle. Good stock. Bring them closer to home during winter months, drive them to higher pastures come spring." Abigail listened attentively, trying to absorb the unfamiliar terminology. Her life in San Francisco had been one of urban luxury theaters, restaurants, society functions. The closest she'd come to ranching was the occasional Sunday ride in Golden Gate Park. "And your books?" she asked, turning the conversation to more familiar territory. "You mentioned they needed organizing." Patrick's expression grew sheepish. "Might be more accurate to say they need creating." "Mary, my sister, tried to teach me, but numbers and I have never been friendly." "Show me," Abigail requested, genuinely curious about the state of the ranch's finances. Back at the house, Patrick led her to a small study off the main living area. The desk was buried under a haphazard collection of papers, receipts, and ledgers in various states of completion. Abigail surveyed the chaos with growing dismay. "When did your sister leave?" she asked carefully. "About 10 months ago. And this is 10 months of records." Patrick rubbed the back of his neck. "More or less, some might be older. I sort of piled things when I didn't know what to do with them." Abigail set Emma down in a makeshift nest of blankets near her feet and began sorting through the nearest stack. Sale receipts for cattle, purchase orders for supplies, wage records for the hands, all jumbled together without rhyme or reason. "Is the ranch profitable?" she asked, unable to discern the financial health of the operation from the disorganized papers. "Should be," Patrick replied. "We had a good year. Cattle prices were strong at the last drive, but honest truth is I couldn't tell you exactly where we stand." Abigail nodded, already formulating a plan to bring order to the chaos. "I'll need a few days to sort through everything, establish proper books. Create a filing system. You know how to do all that?" Patrick asked, impressed. "My father was an accountant before he became an investor," Abigail explained. "He insisted I learn practical skills despite my mother's focus on social graces." She offered a small smile. "He would be pleased to know his lessons proved useful." Patrick smiled back, a genuine expression that transformed his weather-roughened face. "Seems we both had practical fathers." For the next 3 days, Abigail threw herself into organizing the ranch's financial records. She worked during Emma's naps and in the evenings after the baby was asleep, sorting receipts, creating proper ledgers, and establishing a filing system Patrick could maintain after she left. The work was therapeutic in a way, allowing her to focus on something beyond her fears. Patrick proved to be a respectful employer, giving her space to work but available when she had questions. He was unfailingly gentle with Emma, often entertaining the baby with silly faces or stories when Abigail needed both hands free to work. By the 4th day, a picture of the ranch's finances emerged. Abigail waited until after dinner to share her findings, once Emma was settled in her makeshift cradle nearby. "You're doing well," she told Patrick, spreading the newly organized ledgers before him at the kitchen table. "Better than well, actually. The ranch is quite profitable." Relief washed over Patrick's features. "That's good to hear. I was beginning to worry. Your cattle operation is solid. The breeding program your father established is paying dividends in the quality of stock." Abigail pointed to specific entries in the ledger. "However, you're losing money in 3 areas, overpaying for grain when you could buy in bulk with neighboring ranchers, purchasing supplies individually rather than quarterly, and, Patrick prompted when she hesitated. "And your foreman, Mr. Daniels, appears to be skimming from the payroll," she finished quietly. "It's subtle, but the numbers don't align over the past 6 months." Patrick's expression hardened, a glimpse of steel beneath his usually genial demeanor. "You're certain?" Abigail nodded, showing him the discrepancies she'd discovered. "Either it's deliberate theft or extreme carelessness with the men's wages. Either way, it's costing you." "I'll deal with Daniels," Patrick said grimly. "The other issues, the grain and supplies, can you write up recommendations?" "Already done," Abigail replied, producing another sheet of paper covered in her neat handwriting. "I've outlined potential savings and suggested implementation strategies." Patrick studied the document, then looked up at her with newfound respect. "You're remarkable, Abigail. The ranch would benefit greatly from your continued management." The compliment warmed her unexpectedly. "I'm just applying basic accounting principles." "You're doing far more than that," Patrick insisted. "You've brought order to chaos in days, identified theft I'd never have caught, and found ways to increase profits without additional work." He hesitated, then added more softly, "I hope you'll consider staying beyond the 2 weeks we agreed upon." The invitation lingered between them, laden with implications Abigail wasn't ready to confront. She glanced at Emma, sleeping peacefully nearby. "Let's see how the 2 weeks go first," she suggested diplomatically. "I'm still figuring things out." Patrick nodded, accepting her hesitation without pushing. "Fair enough. Though I should warn you, once the hands taste your biscuits, they may block the road if you try to leave." The jest broke the tension, drawing a genuine laugh from Abigail. "My biscuits are hardly extraordinary." "Tell that to men who have been eating cookies burned offerings for months," Patrick retorted with a grin. Their easy conversation continued as they cleared the table and washed the dishes together, falling into a comfortable rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Abigail found herself relaxing, sharing stories of her childhood in Boston before her family moved west, listening as Patrick recounted tales of growing up on the ranch with his siblings. It was only later, lying in bed with Emma sleeping beside her, that Abigail acknowledged the dangerous comfort she was beginning to feel in Patrick's presence. Comfort led to trust, and trust led to vulnerability. She couldn't afford either, not with Charles's shadow still looming over them. Yet as sleep claimed her, Abigail couldn't help wondering what it might be like to belong somewhere safe, with someone who looked at her the way Patrick sometimes did when he thought she wouldn't notice. The next morning, Abigail woke to commotion outside, men's voices raised in anger, the sound of horses approaching at speed. Her first terrified thought was that Charles's men had found them. She snatched Emma from her cradle and peered cautiously out the window. Below, Patrick stood in the yard confronting his foreman, Tom Daniels. 5 other ranch hands formed a loose circle around them, expressions ranging from confusion to anger. The confrontation about the missing wages, Abigail realized with a sinking feeling. Her revelations had forced Patrick's hand. She watched as Daniels, a burly man with a perpetual scowl, jabbed a finger into Patrick's chest. Patrick stood his ground, shoulders squared, saying something Abigail couldn't hear. The tension in the yard was palpable even from her upstairs window. Suddenly, Daniels swung a meaty fist at Patrick's face. Patrick ducked, countering with a swift jab that caught the foreman in the stomach. The men were evenly matched in height, but Daniels had the advantage in bulk. The fight escalated quickly, drawing gasps and shouts from the gathered ranch hands. Daniels landed a solid blow to Patrick's jaw, sending him staggering backward. Before he could press his advantage, Patrick recovered and charged forward, tackling the larger man to the ground. Abigail clutched Emma tighter, her heart racing as the men grappled in the dirt. This violence, the consequence of her discovery, brought unwelcome memories of Charles's rages. She'd never seen Patrick angry before, let alone fighting. The realization that even this seemingly gentle man could be provoked to violence shook her newfound sense of security. The fight ended abruptly when Patrick pinned Daniels to the ground, one knee on his chest, fist raised for another blow. Instead of striking, Patrick said something to the fallen foreman, his expression hard. After a tense moment, Daniels nodded reluctantly. Patrick stood, allowing Daniels to rise. The foreman dusted himself off, glaring at Patrick before stalking toward the bunkhouse, presumably to collect his belongings. The other ranch hands dispersed, returning to their morning duties with backward glances and low conversation. Abigail retreated from the window, settling in the rocking chair with Emma. The violent confrontation had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Was she trading one dangerous situation for another? Patrick had seemed so different from Charles, but perhaps all men resorted to violence when challenged. A knock at her door startled her from these troubled thoughts. "Abigail," Patrick's voice, uncharacteristically hesitant, "are you awake?" She considered pretending to be asleep but decided against it. "Yes," she called. "One moment." She placed Emma in her cradle before opening the door. Patrick stood in the hallway, a bruise darkening along his jawline and a cut above his left eye. He looked exhausted and troubled. "I saw," Abigail said simply, stepping back to allow him entry to the room. Patrick entered but remained near the door, keeping a respectful distance. "I fired Daniels. He didn't take it well, so I gathered." Patrick sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I'm sorry you had to see that. It's not how I handle things normally." "Isn't it?" The question slipped out before Abigail could stop it, revealing more of her fears than she intended. Understanding dawned in Patrick's eyes. "You think I'm like him, your husband." Abigail looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know what to think. I've seen how quickly men's tempers can turn violent." "Abigail," Patrick said quietly, "I didn't start that fight. I defended myself when Daniels threw the first punch." "There's a difference between violence and self-defense. Charles always had justifications too," she countered. "I provoked him. I embarrassed him. I failed him somehow." "Is that what you think happened here?" Patrick asked, his voice gentle despite the accusation. "That I was looking for an excuse to hit someone." Abigail finally met his eyes, searching for the truth. "I don't know, that's the problem. I thought I knew Charles when I married him. I was wrong then. How can I trust my judgment now?" Patrick nodded slowly, accepting her fear without defensiveness. "Fair question. I don't have an easy answer for you, except to say that I've never raised my hand to a woman or child in anger, and I never will, not for any reason." He gestured to his bruised face. "I don't enjoy fighting, Abigail. But I won't let someone steal from me or threaten my ranch either." His honesty was disarming. Abigail found herself wanting to believe him despite her misgivings. "The men respect you," she observed. "They sided with you, not Daniels. They're good men, hard workers." Patrick smiled slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his split lip. "And they appreciate their wages being paid in full, which is more likely now that Daniels is gone." Abigail nodded, some of her tension easing. "Your eye needs tending," she said, noticing the blood dried along his brow. "It's nothing," Patrick dismissed. "I've had worse from breaking horses." "Sit," Abigail instructed, gesturing to the chair by the window. "I'll fetch some water and clean it properly. Infections aren't to be trifled with." Surprisingly, Patrick complied without argument, sinking into the chair while Abigail retrieved the washing bowl and cloth from her dresser. She worked in silence, gently cleaning the cut above his eye, acutely aware of his gaze following her movements. "I would never hurt you, Abigail," he said quietly as she finished. "Or Emma, I need you to know that." The simple declaration, spoken without demand or expectation, touched something deep within Abigail. She paused, cloth in hand, suddenly aware of their proximity, her standing between his knees, his face upturned to hers, vulnerable in a way Charles had never been. "I believe you," she whispered, surprised to discover she meant it. Something shifted between them in that moment, a tentative trust taking root where only wariness had existed before. Patrick's eyes, a warm hazel she hadn't properly noticed until now, held her steadily, neither demanding nor retreating. Emma's sudden cry broke the moment. Abigail stepped back, flustered, turning quickly to attend to the baby. By the time she had lifted Emma from her cradle, Patrick had risen from the chair. "I should let you two have your privacy," he said, moving toward the door. "And I need to speak with the hands about reorganizing duties now that Daniels is gone." Abigail nodded, cradling Emma against her shoulder. "Of course." Patrick paused at the doorway. "Thank you for tending the cut and for trusting me enough to say so." After he left, Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, gently patting Emma's back as she reflected on the morning's events. The violence had frightened her, yes. But Patrick's response to her fear, his patience, his willingness to acknowledge her concerns without anger, stood in stark contrast to Charles's reactions whenever she'd questioned him. Perhaps, she thought as Emma settled contentedly against her, there were indeed different kinds of men in the world. The challenge was learning to recognize them. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to life at the Irwin ranch. With Daniels gone, Patrick took on the foreman's duties himself, rising before dawn and returning late, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. Abigail continued organizing the ranch's business affairs, establishing systems for Patrick to maintain once she left. Except increasingly, thoughts of leaving felt less urgent, less necessary. The ranch was becoming familiar, the creak of specific floorboards, the way light filled the kitchen at breakfast, the evening chorus of crickets and distant cattle lowing. Emma thrived in the peaceful environment, growing chubbier and more alert each day. A week after the fight with Daniels, Abigail sat on the front porch rocking Emma in the late afternoon sun when Patrick rode in from the range. She watched as he dismounted with fluid grace, speaking quietly to his horse as he loosened the saddle girth. There was something compelling about the way he moved, confident but never aggressive, powerful but controlled. "Pleasant evening," Patrick commented as he approached the porch, removing his hat. "It is," Abigail agreed, smiling as Emma reached pudgy hands toward him. The baby had developed an unmistakable fondness for Patrick, lighting up whenever he entered a room. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to Emma. Abigail nodded, passing the baby to him. Patrick settled Emma comfortably in his arms, chuckling when she immediately grabbed for his bandana. "She's getting stronger," he observed as tiny fingers yanked at the fabric. "Going to be riding her own pony before we know it." The casual we caught Abigail's attention. It implied a shared future she wasn't ready to acknowledge, yet couldn't entirely dismiss either. Their agreed-upon 2 weeks would end in just 3 days. The thought brought an unexpected hollowness to her chest. "Patrick," she began carefully, "I've been thinking about our arrangement." His expression sobered, though he continued bouncing Emma gently in his arms. "Your 2 weeks are nearly up." "Yes." Abigail smoothed her skirts, gathering courage. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for us." "More than I can express." "But you're still planning to leave," Patrick concluded, his voice neutral. "I should," Abigail said, surprising herself with the qualification. "Charles won't stop looking for us. Staying in one place too long is dangerous." Patrick studied her face, then looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep against his chest, tiny fingers still clutching his bandana. "What if it doesn't have to be?" he asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "Charles Jensen is looking for his wife and child," Patrick said carefully. "But what if Abigail Jensen no longer existed? What if, instead, there was a Mrs. Irwin living on a ranch outside Piotch with her husband and daughter?" Abigail stared at him, stunned by the implication. "Are you proposing marriage?" Patrick shifted Emma gently to his shoulder, his gaze steady on Abigail's face. "I know it's sudden, unconventional, but hear me out before you decide." Heart racing, Abigail nodded for him to continue. "In the short time you've been here, you've transformed the ranch's operations. You're intelligent, capable, and frankly, the best manager this place has ever seen." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Beyond that, I enjoy your company, Abigail, your perspective, your strength." And Emma, well, He glanced at the sleeping baby, his expression softening. I've grown fond of her too. That's hardly grounds for marriage, Abigail pointed out, though her voice lacked conviction. No, Patrick agreed, but safety might be. As my wife, you'd have legal protection from Charles. He couldn't claim you or Emma without a significant legal battle, one that would expose him to public scrutiny he likely wouldn't risk. The practical reasoning was compelling, but Abigail sensed there was more Patrick wasn't saying. And what would you gain from this arrangement? A partner, Patrick answered simply. Someone to share the burden of running this place, a future that feels less solitary. His gaze dropped briefly to Emma. And perhaps, in time, a family. The honesty in his voice touched Abigail deeply. This wasn't a man offering charity or seeking control. This was someone who had recognized a mutual benefit, a possible shared future built on respect rather than domination. You hardly know me, she whispered. I know enough, Patrick countered. I know you're brave enough to flee a dangerous situation to protect your child. Smart enough to organize financial records that stumped me for months. Kind enough to tend my wounds without judgment. His voice softened. And beautiful enough that I find myself watching the door when I'm in the fields, looking forward to seeing you at the end of each day. The admission of attraction, tentative but clear, brought warmth to Abigail's cheeks. She'd noticed his glances, of course, but had attributed them to polite interest or concern for her welfare. The realization that Patrick found her appealing as a woman, not just as a housekeeper or accountant, was both flattering and unsettling. This isn't a decision to make lightly, Abigail said, buying time to process her turbulent emotions. I agree completely, Patrick said, carefully returning Emma to her arms. Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless of your 2-week deadline. He replaced his hat, tipping the brim slightly. I'll see to my horse and wash up for supper. As he walked toward the stables, Abigail remained on the porch, her mind racing. Marriage to Patrick would offer security, stability, a home for Emma. It would solve her most pressing problems. But marriage based primarily on practical considerations hadn't that been her mistake with Charles. She'd married him for security and social position, only to discover too late the cruelty beneath his polished exterior. Yet Patrick was nothing like Charles. Where Charles had been controlling, Patrick offered freedom. Where Charles demanded perfection, Patrick appreciated effort. Where Charles saw Emma as an inconvenience, Patrick treated her with genuine affection. Could a marriage built on mutual respect and shared goals grow into something more? Abigail wasn't certain. But as she looked down at Emma, peaceful in her arms, she wondered if perhaps the chance was worth taking. Supper that evening was a quiet affair, both Abigail and Patrick lost in their own thoughts. They worked together afterward, cleaning up in companionable silence, their movements around the kitchen falling into an easy rhythm that spoke of growing familiarity. I'll check the property before turning in, Patrick said as they finished, a nightly ritual he never neglected. Lock the door behind me, Abigail nodded, following him to the front door. As he stepped onto the porch, she called after him. Patrick, he turned, his expression questioning. I haven't given you an answer yet, she said carefully, but I want you to know I'm considering your offer. Seriously considering it. A smile broke across his face, transforming his features. That's all I can ask for, he replied, his voice warm with hope. Good night, Abigail. Good night, she whispered, watching him walk into the darkness before closing and locking the door as promised. Upstairs, after settling Emma for the night, Abigail sat at the small writing desk in her room. She pulled out a sheet of paper and began listing the pros and cons of Patrick's proposal, as her father had taught her to do when facing difficult decisions. The practical advantages were clear and numerous. Security for herself and Emma, legal protection from Charles, financial stability, a respectable position in the community. The potential disadvantages were more nebulous. The risk of another unhappy marriage, the possibility that Patrick might change once they were wed, the challenge of building a life with someone she barely knew. Yet as she stared at the two columns, Abigail realized the exercise wasn't capturing the most important factor, the growing warmth she felt in Patrick's presence. The way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, the comfort of their evening conversations, the tenderness with which he handled Emma. These weren't practical considerations. They were feelings, dangerous, unpredictable feelings she'd sworn to guard against after Charles. Yet they existed nonetheless, growing stronger with each passing day. Abigail set down her pen and moved to the window, gazing out at the moonlit ranch yard. In the distance, she could make out Patrick's figure as he completed his nightly check of the property, lantern in hand as he moved between buildings with purposeful strides. This was a good man, she thought. Imperfect, perhaps, as all people were, but fundamentally good in ways Charles had never been. A man who offered partnership rather than ownership, respect rather than subjugation. Could she take this leap of faith? Did she dare? The answer came to her with unexpected clarity as she watched Patrick return to the house, his lantern a beacon in the darkness. Yes, she could dare, not with blind trust, but with open eyes and a cautious heart ready to believe in possibility again. The next morning, Abigail rose early, dressing carefully in the clean dress Patrick had provided her first day at the ranch. She pinned her hair simply but neatly, wanting to look composed for the conversation ahead. Emma was unusually cooperative, content to play with a wooden spoon while Abigail prepared breakfast. By the time Patrick came in from the morning chores, coffee was brewing and biscuits were browning in the oven. "Good morning," he greeted, removing his hat and hanging it by the door. He paused, taking in her appearance. "You look nice." "Thank you," Abigail replied, feeling a flutter of nervousness. "I thought we might talk after breakfast if you have time before heading out to the range." Understanding dawned in Patrick's eyes. "I'll make time." They ate breakfast with minimal conversation, though the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Patrick entertained Emma with his usual silly faces, drawing giggles from the baby that lightened the mood considerably. After the dishes were cleared, Patrick poured them each a fresh cup of coffee and sat across from Abigail at the kitchen table. Emma contentedly chewed on a biscuit in Abigail's lap. "You've reached a decision," Patrick observed, his tone carefully neutral. Abigail nodded, gathering her courage. "I have. Before I tell you, though, I need to ask a few questions. Of course. This marriage you're proposing, what exactly would it entail?" Abigail asked directly. "Would it be a marriage in name only, a legal arrangement for protection, or are you expecting more?" Patrick considered his response carefully. "I'm proposing a genuine marriage, Abigail, a partnership in all senses of the word." He met her gaze steadily. "That said, I understand you've been through a terrible ordeal with your previous husband. I would never rush or pressure you regarding the physical aspects of marriage. We could begin as partners and friends and let the rest develop naturally, if it does." His sensitivity on the matter touched Abigail deeply. Charles had never considered her feelings or comfort in their marital relations, viewing her body as his property to use as he pleased. "And Emma," Abigail pressed, "what would your relationship with her be?" "I would raise her as my own," Patrick said without hesitation. "Love her, provide for her, protect her, give her my name if you're willing." "Even though she's another man's child, she's your child," Patrick corrected gently. "That's what matters to me." Abigail nodded, her final concern rising to her lips. "And if Charles finds us, if he comes here?" Patrick's expression hardened slightly. "Then he'll discover that the law in Nevada territory respects a husband's right to protect his family. I won't seek violence, Abigail, but I won't allow him to threaten you or Emma either." The quiet determination in his voice reassured her more than any dramatic promises could have. This was not bravado or posturing. It was simply Patrick, straightforward, resolute, trustworthy. "Yes," Abigail said softly. Patrick's eyebrows rose. "Yes." "Yes, I'll marry you," she clarified, a smile spreading across her face despite her nervousness. "Not just for protection or practicality, though those are compelling reasons, but because I've come to admire you, Patrick, to respect you. And I believe we could build a good life together, for ourselves and for Emma." The joy that transformed Patrick's face was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. He reached across the table, offering his hand palm up in invitation. Abigail placed her hand in his, savoring the warmth of his gentle grip. "You've made me very happy, Abigail," he said simply. "I promise to do everything in my power to ensure you never regret this decision." Emma chose that moment to throw her half-eaten biscuit onto the table with a delighted squeal, breaking the solemnity of the moment. Both adults laughed, the tension dissolving into shared amusement. "I believe that's Emma's way of approving the match," Patrick said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Or demanding attention," Abigail countered wryly. "Either way, we should probably make this official soon." Patrick squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "The circuit judge passes through Piotch every other Tuesday. That gives us 5 days to prepare if you're amenable." 5 days, Abigail echoed, the reality of her decision settling in. "Yes, that should be sufficient." "I'll ride into town this afternoon to speak with Reverend Collins about arranging the ceremony," Patrick said, his practical nature reasserting itself. "Is there anything you need from town? A dress, perhaps?" Abigail looked down at her borrowed garment, suddenly aware of how little she possessed. "I hadn't thought about a wedding dress." "Mrs. Hollister runs the dry goods store," Patrick suggested. "She's a decent seamstress, might be able to alter something suitable on short notice, or we could order from the catalog, though it wouldn't arrive in time for the ceremony." "Something simple would be fine," Abigail assured him, touched by his consideration. "I don't need anything elaborate." Patrick nodded, though his expression suggested he had his own thoughts on the matter. "We'll figure it out." He rose from the table, suddenly looking slightly uncertain. "I should tend to the herd, but—" He hesitated, then bent down and pressed a gentle, brief kiss to Abigail's forehead. "Thank you," he murmured, "for trusting me with your future and Emma's." Before Abigail could respond, he had collected his hat and was out the door, his long strides carrying him swiftly toward the stables. She sat at the table for several minutes afterward, one hand absently touching the spot where his lips had pressed against her skin, a small smile playing at her lips. "Well, Emma," she said to the baby, who was happily smashing crumbs on the table, "it seems we're staying after all." The next 5 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Patrick returned from town with news that Reverend Collins had agreed to perform the ceremony on Tuesday afternoon, followed by a small reception at the ranch. He'd also spoken with Mrs. Hollister, who had promised to bring several dress options for Abigail to consider. True to his word, the next day Mrs. Hollister arrived in a buggy laden with garment boxes. A plump, cheerful woman with graying hair and quick, competent hands, she took charge of the fitting with grandmotherly authority. "Mr. Irwin says price is no object," she informed Abigail as she laid out 3 dresses across the bed. "Says his bride should have whatever makes her happy." Abigail blushed at the extravagance, but couldn't deny the pleasure of selecting her own garments after months of wearing whatever Charles deemed appropriate. The dresses were simpler than the fashionable gowns she'd worn in San Francisco, but the fabrics were good quality and the styling elegant in a practical Western way. "This one," Abigail decided, touching a cream-colored dress with delicate embroidery along the collar and cuffs. "For the wedding." Mrs. Hollister nodded approvingly. "Excellent choice, brings out the gold in your hair." She bustled around Abigail with pins and measuring tape. "Mr. Irwin's a good man," she added casually as she worked. "Town was surprised to hear he's marrying, but pleased for him. He deserves happiness after losing his parents and then Mary moving east." "You know him well?" Abigail asked, curious about Patrick's standing in the community. "Known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper," Mrs. Hollister confirmed. "Honest as the day is long, fair in his dealings. Generous when folks fall on hard times." She pinned a seam at Abigail's waist. His mother would be pleased to see him settling down with a family at last. The simple endorsement meant more to Abigail than elaborate promises or passionate declarations might have. This was a community that knew Patrick Irwin well and thought highly of him not for his wealth or position, but for his character. While Mrs. Hollister worked on the wedding dress alterations, Patrick busied himself with preparations for the reception. He arranged for one of the ranch hands who played fiddle to provide music, ordered special supplies from town, and even found a small silver band that had belonged to his mother. offering it tentatively as a wedding ring if Abigail approved. The night before the wedding, after Emma was asleep, Abigail and Patrick sat together on the porch swing, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. A comfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle creaking of the swing and distant night sounds of the ranch. Nervous? Patrick asked eventually. A little, Abigail admitted. It's happening so quickly. Patrick nodded, his shoulder warm against hers. We can delay if you need more time. The judge will be back through in a month. No, Abigail said, surprised by her own certainty. I'm ready, nervous but ready. That makes two of us then, Patrick confessed with a small smile. I never thought I'd marry. Always figured I'd run this place alone until I was too old, then sell it off and move to town like old Mr. Fitzpatrick did. What changed your mind? Abigail asked. Patrick was quiet for a moment, considering. Finding you and Emma in my barn, he said finally, seeing you there so fierce in your protection of her despite your exhaustion, something just clicked into place. He looked at her directly. I knew I wanted to help you to keep you both safe. The rest grew from there. His honesty disarmed her, as it always did. I'm glad we found your barn, Abigail said softly. Of all the places we could have sought shelter that night. Providence, Patrick suggested, his voice low. My mother would have called it that. Perhaps she was right, Abigail murmured. They sat in silence again, the swing moving gently beneath them. After a while, Patrick's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. The simple contact felt more intimate than any kiss might have, a promise, a connection, a beginning. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, unusually pleasant for late October. Abigail woke early, a mixture of excitement and nervousness fluttering in her stomach. Patrick had moved to the bunkhouse the previous night for propriety's sake. He'd explained with a touch of old-fashioned gallantry that Abigail found unexpectedly charming. Mrs. Hollister arrived mid-morning with the altered wedding dress, and a young woman from town who helped arrange Abigail's hair in a simple but elegant style, adorned with small white flowers from the ranch garden. Emma, dressed in a new white dress Patrick had somehow procured from town, watched the preparations with wide-eyed fascination. You look beautiful, madam, the young woman said as she secured the final pin in Abigail's hair. Abigail studied her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing herself. The woman who looked back at her seemed years younger than she felt, her cheeks flushed with color, her eyes bright with anticipation rather than dulled by fear. The cream-colored dress complemented her fair complexion and brought out golden highlights in her light brown hair. For the first time in years, she looked like herself, not Charles Jensen's perfectly groomed wife, but Abigail, as she might have been had her life taken a different path. Thank you, she said, genuinely pleased with the transformation. A soft knock at the door heralded the arrival of Reverend Collins, a kindly older gentleman with white hair and twinkling eyes. The groom awaits, Mrs. Jensen, he announced with a warm smile. And I must say, he's as nervous as any young buck I've ever married, pacing the parlor like a caged mountain lion. The image of the usually composed Patrick pacing anxiously brought a smile to Abigail's lips. Then we shouldn't keep him waiting, Reverend. Mrs. Hollister handed Emma to Abigail, then bustled ahead to alert the small gathering of guests, primarily ranch hands, and a few townspeople Patrick considered friends. Abigail followed more slowly, carrying Emma and taking a moment to calm her own racing heart. At the top of the stairs, she paused, looking down into the parlor where Patrick stood with his back to her, tall and straight in a new black suit, his dark hair neatly combed. As if sensing her presence, he turned, his gaze finding her immediately. The expression that crossed his face in that moment, wonder, admiration, joy, would remain etched in Abigail's memory for years to come. It was the look of a man seeing not just a bride, but a future unfolding before him. Abigail descended the stairs slowly, holding Emma securely with one arm. When she reached Patrick, he extended his hand to her, his eyes never leaving her face. You're breathtaking, he said quietly, for her ears alone. "So are you," she replied honestly, taking in his transformation from rugged rancher to distinguished groom. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Reverend Collins spoke eloquently about partnership, respect, and building a life together. Patrick's voice was steady as he recited his vows, his hand warm around Abigail's as he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. Abigail's own voice trembled slightly with emotion as she promised to honor and cherish him, holding Emma between them like a physical manifestation of the family they were creating. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Collins declared, beaming at the couple. "Mr. Irwin, you may kiss your bride." Patrick hesitated, his eyes questioning. They hadn't discussed this moment, and he seemed unwilling to presume. Abigail made the decision for him, rising slightly on her tiptoes to press her lips gently against his. The kiss was brief but tender, a promise rather than a passion. When they parted, Patrick's smile was radiant. "Mrs. Irwin," he murmured, the name sounding right in a way Mrs. Jensen never had. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. The ranch hands offered congratulations with awkward sincerity, clearly pleased for their boss. Mrs. Hollister and the other town guests brought small gifts and well wishes. The fiddler played lively tunes that soon had everyone clapping along, and the food Patrick had arranged a whole roast pig, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and a stunning wedding cake from Piacha's bakery was abundant and delicious. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, Patrick found Abigail sitting on a bench near the garden, Emma sleeping in her arms after the excitement of the day. "Happy?" he asked, settling beside her. "Very," Abigail assured him, meaning it. The day had been perfect in its simplicity, no elaborate society affair like her first wedding, but authentic and warm in a way that celebration had never been. Patrick's arm settled comfortably around her shoulders. "The guests will be leaving soon. I've asked Mrs. Hollister to stay the night to help with Emma if that's agreeable to you." The implication was clear. Their wedding night. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's thoughtful," she managed. "Though it isn't necessary if you'd prefer to wait. As you said before, we can take things slowly." Patrick turned to face her, his expression earnest. "Abigail, I meant what I said about patience. Tonight, tomorrow, a month from now, whenever you're ready is when it will be right. There's no hurry." His consideration touched her deeply. With Charles, the wedding night had been a painful establishment of ownership that had set the tone for their entire marriage. Patrick was offering something entirely different: partnership, respect, choice. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning against his shoulder, "for everything." They sat together as twilight deepened, watching the celebration wind down, comfortable in their new roles as husband and wife. Whatever the night might bring, whatever challenges the future held, Abigail knew with growing certainty that she had made the right choice. After the last guests departed, and Mrs. Hollister had taken Emma to the nursery for the night, Abigail changed into a simple nightgown and robe, her nervousness returning as she brushed out her hair before the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was a stranger once more, no longer Miss Abigail, no longer Mrs. Jensen, but Mrs. Irwin, a new identity she was only beginning to understand. A soft knock at the bedroom door startled her from her reflections. "Abigail," Patrick's voice, low and respectful. "May I come in?" "Yes," she called, rising from the vanity and tightening the sash of her robe. Patrick entered, also changed for the night in simple cotton pants and a loose shirt. He carried 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey, looking almost as nervous as Abigail felt. "I thought perhaps a nightcap might help us both relax," he offered, holding up the bottle. "My father's best, saved for special occasions." Abigail smiled, grateful for the suggestion. "That sounds lovely." They settled on the small sofa near the fireplace, a careful distance between them as Patrick poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into each glass. He handed one to Abigail, then raised his own. "To new beginnings," he proposed. "New beginnings," Abigail echoed, sipping the whiskey and welcoming the warm burn as it traveled down her throat. They drank in companionable silence for a few moments, the tension gradually easing between them. "I want you to know," Patrick said eventually, setting his glass aside, that I already consider this marriage real and binding regardless of physical considerations. You're my wife in every way that matters." Abigail studied him in the firelight, this man who had become her husband with such unexpected speed. She saw kindness in the lines around his eyes, strength in the set of his shoulders, honesty in his direct gaze. Nothing like Charles with his cold calculation and controlled rage. "I believe you," she said softly. Setting her own glass down, she moved closer on the sofa. "And I would like this to be a complete marriage, Patrick, perhaps not all at once, but beginning tonight, if you're willing." The look that crossed Patrick's face was one of wonder mingled with desire. "Are you certain? There's no rush, Abigail." In answer, she reached out and took his hand, bringing it to rest against her cheek. "I'm certain. I want to know what it's like, with someone kind, someone who sees me as a person, not a possession." Patrick's thumb traced gently along her cheekbone. "I see you, Abigail," he murmured. "All of you." He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and pressed his lips to hers. Unlike the chaste kiss they had shared during the ceremony, this one lingered, warm and exploratory. Abigail found herself responding naturally, her hand rising to his shoulder, drawing him closer. The kiss deepened gradually, Patrick's hand moving to cup the back of her neck, Abigail's fingers threading through his hair. There was no demand in his touch, only invitation, each caress asking a question, each response granting permission for more. When they finally parted, both were breathing more quickly, a flush coloring Abigail's cheeks. "Was that all right?" Patrick asked, his voice husky. "More than all right," Abigail assured him, surprised by the unfamiliar warmth spreading through her body. With Charles, intimacy had always been something to endure, never to enjoy. This was entirely different, an awakening of sensations she hadn't known she could feel. Patrick smiled, pressing another gentle kiss to her lips before standing and offering his hand. "Shall we?" he asked, gesturing toward the bed. Abigail placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her across the room. What followed was a slow, tender discovery of each other, Patrick's hands gentle but sure as they explored, his attention focused entirely on her comfort and pleasure. For the first time, Abigail understood that physical intimacy could be a conversation rather than a conquest, a giving rather than a taking. Later, lying in Patrick's arms as moonlight filtered through the curtains, Abigail felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This marriage, begun as a practical arrangement, had already become something more, something genuine and promising. "Are you all right?" Patrick murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. "Yes," Abigail replied, nestling closer against his chest. "I'm perfect." Life at the Irwin Ranch settled into a new rhythm in the weeks following the wedding. Abigail continued managing the ranch's business affairs, now with the added authority of being the owner's wife. Patrick worked the land and cattle with his usual dedication, but now returned each evening to a true home, not just a house. Emma thrived under their combined care, growing stronger and more adventurous by the day. She began pulling herself up on furniture, taking wobbly steps while holding Patrick's fingers, babbling constantly in her own incomprehensible language. The transformation of Patrick's bachelor household into a family home happened gradually but steadily. Abigail added touches of comfort and beauty, curtains sewn from fabric ordered from the mercantile, wildflowers gathered from the meadows and arranged in mason jars, small modifications to make the house more practical for a child's presence. As autumn deepened toward winter, the work on the ranch intensified. Cattle needed to be moved to lower pastures, buildings prepared for the coming cold, supplies stockpiled against the possibility of being snowbound for days or weeks. Patrick worked from dawn until dusk, often returning so exhausted he could barely stay awake through supper. Yet even in his exhaustion, he made time for Emma, reading to her from well-worn books, carving simple wooden toys for her amusement, teaching her the names of ranch animals with patient repetition. And for Abigail, there were small gestures of affection, a hand at the small of her back as they passed in the kitchen, wild berries collected during his rides, and presented with shy pride, lingering kisses before sleep claimed him. Their physical relationship developed slowly but steadily, each encounter building trust and intimacy. Patrick remained patient and attentive, never presuming, always ensuring Abigail's comfort and pleasure. For her part, Abigail discovered a capacity for passion she hadn't known existed, her body responding to Patrick's touch with increasing eagerness as the initial hesitation faded. By the time the first snow dusted the mountains in late November, Abigail realized with some surprise that she was happy truly. Deeply happy in a way she had never experienced in San Francisco. The ranch had become home, Patrick had become family, and the fear that had driven her flight from Charles had receded to a distant shadow, which made the letter that arrived in early December all the more devastating. Patrick had ridden into town for supplies ahead of an approaching storm, returning with provisions, mail, and a troubled expression. He waited until Emma was down for her afternoon nap before handing Abigail the envelope addressed to the owner, Irwin Ranch. "This came to the post office," he said quietly. "Postmaster Jenkins gave it to me." Abigail examined the fine stationery, the elegant handwriting, and felt ice form in her stomach. She knew that hand. She'd seen it on countless notes and invitations during her marriage to Charles. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and extracted a single sheet of paper. "Mr. Irwin," the letter began, bypassing any greeting, "it has come to my attention that you are harboring my wife and child at your property outside Piotch. While I understand Abigail may have presented herself as unmarried, I assure you she remains legally bound to me, Charles Jensen of San Francisco. Similarly, the child Emma is my daughter and heir. I write to offer you a simple arrangement. Return my family to me promptly, and I will compensate you generously for your trouble. Refuse, and I will be forced to take legal action to recover what is mine. My representatives will call upon you within the month to facilitate the transfer. Should you be concerned about my intentions toward Abigail, be assured that I wish only to restore my family. Whatever tales of mistreatment she may have told are the products of a delicate mind overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood. Respectfully, Charles Jensen, Esquire." Abigail lowered the letter, her face drained of color. "He found us," she whispered. "How did he find us?" Patrick took the letter, reading it with a deepening frown. "He doesn't know you're my wife," he noted. "He thinks I'm harboring you, not married to you." "That won't matter," Abigail said, rising from her chair and pacing anxiously. "Charles has connections, influential friends. If he's found us in Piotch, he can find documentation of our marriage. And when he does, he'll discover he has no legal claim to you," Patrick pointed out. "We were legally married. You're my wife now, not his." "You don't understand," Abigail said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Charles doesn't accept defeat. He'll claim I'm still legally married to him, that our marriage was never properly dissolved. He'll say I committed bigamy. Her voice broke. "He'll take Emma. The courts almost always favor the father's rights, especially a father with Charles's wealth and connections." Patrick crossed to her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Abigail, look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly to his face. "I promise to protect you and Emma," he said firmly. "That promise stands. Charles Jensen is not taking either of you anywhere." "But how can you stop him?" Abigail asked, her voice small. "He has money, lawyers, influence." "And I have something he doesn't," Patrick countered. "The truth. You fled because he was violent, because he threatened Emma. There are laws against that, Abigail, even for wealthy men from San Francisco. Laws that are rarely enforced when the man has enough money," Abigail pointed out bitterly. "Perhaps in California," Patrick acknowledged. "But this is Nevada territory. Things work differently here." He led her back to the chair, kneeling before her to maintain eye contact. "Listen to me. The first thing we do is establish that you're my wife legally and publicly. We'll go to town tomorrow, speak with Judge Wilson, make sure our marriage certificate is properly filed and witnessed. And then we wait," Patrick said grimly. "If Jensen sends representatives as he threatens, they'll find not a frightened runaway but Mrs. Patrick Irwin, respected wife of a rancher living happily with her husband and child. And if Charles comes himself, Abigail asked, voicing her deepest fear. Then he'll find me waiting, Patrick said simply, his voice hardening. And he'll discover that threatening my family is the biggest mistake he could make. Despite his reassurances, fear lingered in Abigail's heart. She'd seen Charles's determination, his refusal to accept loss or defeat. He wouldn't simply give up because she had remarried. He would view it as a challenge to his authority, his ownership. That night, after Emma was asleep, Abigail stood at the bedroom window watching snow begin to fall, heavy flakes illuminated by moonlight as they drifted past the glass. Patrick's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting gently on her head. "We should leave," Abigail said quietly. "Go somewhere Charles can't find us, Montana perhaps, or Canada." "Running isn't the answer," Patrick replied, his voice a rumble she could feel against her back. "This is our home, Abigail, our land. I won't let Charles Jensen drive us from it." "I'm afraid," she admitted, turning in his arms to press her face against his chest. "Not for myself, but for Emma, for you. Charles is dangerous when he's thwarted." "So am I," Patrick said simply, the steel in his voice matching the strength in his embrace. "The difference is I'm dangerous in defense of those I love, not in pursuit of control." It was the first time either of them had used the word love, even obliquely. Abigail looked up at him, searching his face in the dim light. "Do you?" she asked softly. "Love us?" Patrick's expression softened, his eyes warm with emotion. "From the moment I found you in the barn," he confessed. "Not romantic love at first, of course. But a certainty that you and Emma belonged in my care, that grew into something more with each day." His hand cradled her cheek gently. "Yes, Abigail, I love you both, more than I thought possible." The simple declaration, spoken without drama or demands, filled a space in Abigail's heart she hadn't known was empty. Charles had never said those words to her, not even during their courtship. He had spoken of possession, of satisfaction with her appearance or behavior, but never of love. "I love you too," she whispered, realizing as she spoke that it was true. This wasn't the breathless infatuation she'd felt for Charles during their brief courtship. It was deeper, steadier, a love built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and growing trust. Patrick's kiss was tender, a sealing of promises spoken and unspoken. When it ended, he rested his forehead against hers. "We will face Charles Jensen together," he murmured. "And he will discover that you and Emma are not possessions to be reclaimed, but beloved family to be protected at all costs." That night, their lovemaking held a new intensity, a claiming, yes, but one that went both ways. Abigail matched Patrick's passion with her own, their bodies communicating what words could not fully express. Afterward, lying in the peaceful darkness with Patrick's steady breathing beside her, Abigail found her fear had been replaced by a quiet resolve. Charles had controlled her through fear for too long. With Patrick's love bolstering her courage, she was ready to stand and fight. The next morning, they rode into Piotch despite the fresh snow, Emma bundled securely against Abigail's chest. The town was quiet, many businesses closed due to the weather, but Judge Wilson's office was open as Patrick had hoped. The judge, a portly man with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened carefully to their situation. Patrick presented their marriage certificate, explaining their concern that Charles Jensen might challenge its validity. "Proper and legal by the laws of Nevada Territory," Judge Wilson confirmed after examining the document. "Reverend Collins is authorized to perform marriages and the witnesses are reputable citizens." He looked up at Abigail. "Were you legally divorced from your first husband before marrying Mr. Irwin, madam?" "No, Your Honor," Abigail admitted, "but I fled because he was abusive." "He threatened our child," the judge nodded thoughtfully. "Abandonment due to cruelty is grounds for divorce in this territory, especially when a child's safety is concerned." He shuffled through some papers on his desk. "To be safe, we should file divorce proceedings against Mr. Jensen immediately, citing his cruelty and threats. It's a formality at this point since your marriage to Mr. Irwin is valid regardless, but it will strengthen your position if he challenges the union. Relief flooded through Abigail. You mean our marriage is legal even without a formal divorce? In this territory, yes, Judge Wilson confirmed. The law recognizes that women in abusive situations often cannot obtain formal divorces before fleeing. Your marriage to Mr. Irwin is valid and binding. He frowned, adding, "That said, Mr. Jensen has resources that could make things difficult. Filing for divorce from him will close any potential loopholes he might exploit." For the next hour, the judge walked them through the necessary paperwork, asking pointed questions about Charles's behavior that Abigail answered with growing confidence. Patrick's steady presence beside her gave her strength to speak of things she had previously kept buried: the escalating violence, Charles's drinking, his threats toward Emma. By the time they left the judge's office, divorce proceedings had been initiated against Charles Jensen, and their marriage certificate had been formally registered with additional affidavits confirming its validity. "How do you feel?" Patrick asked as he helped Abigail into the wagon for the return journey. "Stronger," she replied, adjusting Emma's blankets against the cold. "For the first time, I feel like I'm fighting back instead of just running." Patrick smiled, climbing up beside her and taking the reins. "That's my brave wife." As they drove back to the ranch, snow beginning to fall again around them, Abigail felt a growing sense of determination. Charles might have found them, but he would not find the same frightened woman who had fled San Francisco. He would find Abigail Irwin, wife, mother, and partner to a man who valued her strength rather than demanding her submission. Let him come, she thought as the ranch appeared through the swirling snow. "We are ready." December deepened, bringing heavier snows and bitter cold. The ranch settled into its winter routine, feeding livestock, maintaining buildings, staying warm and well-supplied while waiting for spring. Patrick doubled the night patrols, assigning trusted hands to watch for strangers approaching the property. But as weeks passed with no sign of Charles's threatened representatives, tension began to ease. Christmas approached, bringing a festive atmosphere to the ranch house. Abigail decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, teaching Patrick traditional carols as they worked together in the evenings. They planned simple gifts for each other and for Emma, who would experience her first Christmas with wide-eyed wonder. 3 days before Christmas, Patrick rode to town for final supplies and mail. When he returned, his expression was grim once more. "Another letter?" Abigail asked, her heart sinking as she met him at the door. Patrick shook his head, stomping snow from his boots. "News from Postmaster Jenkins. A private investigator from San Francisco has been asking questions around town, showing a photograph of you and Emma." Abigail's grip tightened on the doorframe. "Charles's man." "Most likely," Patrick agreed, removing his coat. "Jenkins told him he didn't recognize you, but the man's been speaking to others in town. It's only a matter of time before someone mentions our marriage." "What do we do?" Abigail asked, fear rising once more. "Nothing changes," Patrick said firmly. "We've filed the divorce petition, confirmed our marriage is legal. We're prepared." He drew her into his arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Don't let this ruin our Christmas, Abigail. We'll face whatever comes, but until then, let's celebrate as a family." She nodded against his chest, drawing strength from his calm resolve. "You're right. Emma deserves a proper Christmas." The next days passed in a blur of preparation. Patrick and 2 ranch hands cut a small pine tree from the property, setting it up in the parlor where Abigail decorated it with paper ornaments, strings of cranberries, and small candles. They baked cookies, prepared special meals, and wrapped modest gifts in colorful paper ordered from the mercantile. Christmas Eve arrived cold but clear, stars brilliant in the dark sky as they gathered in the parlor after supper. Emma, now actively crawling and pulling herself up on furniture, was fascinated by the tree, constantly attempting to reach the shiny ornaments despite gentle discouragement. "Perhaps her gift tonight," Patrick suggested, nodding toward a small package wrapped in red paper. "She's too excited to wait for morning." Abigail smiled, retrieving the package. "I think you're the one who can't wait," she teased, noting Patrick's barely concealed enthusiasm. His childlike excitement about Christmas had been one of the unexpected delights of the season. Guilty, he admitted with a grin, though you can't tell me you're not eager to see her reaction. Fair point, Abigail conceded, placing Emma on a blanket near the fire and helping her unwrap the package. Inside was a small cloth doll with embroidered features, dressed in a blue gingham dress that matched a larger version Abigail often wore. Emma's eyes widened as she grasped the doll, immediately bringing it to her mouth for an experimental taste. "You like your baby?" Patrick asked, crouching beside her. "Your mama made her special for you." Emma removed the doll from her mouth long enough to offer a drooly grin and a stream of babble that sounded remarkably like baby, though Abigail suspected it was coincidence rather than actual speech. "I believe that's approval," Patrick chuckled, ruffling Emma's fine hair affectionately. "Your turn," Abigail said, handing Patrick a package wrapped in brown paper tied with string, "since you're as impatient as our daughter." Patrick accepted the gift with exaggerated solemnity. "A man can never be too eager for presents from his beautiful wife," he declared, untying the string carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal embossed with his initials, accompanied by a fine fountain pen. Patrick ran his fingers over the cover reverently. "It's wonderful," he said, his voice warm with appreciation. "How did you know I've always wanted a proper journal? You mentioned once that your father kept records of the ranch's history," Abigail explained. "I thought you might want to continue the tradition. For Emma and—" She hesitated, then continued more softly, "for any future children who might want to know their heritage." Patrick's eyes lifted to hers, understanding the subtle message in her words. They had discussed the possibility of more children someday, but always as a distant prospect. Now, with Emma nearly 9 months old and their marriage growing stronger each day, the idea seemed less abstract. "It's perfect," he said, reaching for her hand and squeezing it gently. "Thank you." He set the journal aside and retrieved a small box from beneath the tree. "Your turn now." Abigail opened the box to find a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. When she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal a lock of Emma's hair on one side and a small, carefully cut photograph of Patrick on the other. "Oh, Patrick," she breathed, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful. So you'll always have us close to your heart," he explained, taking the necklace and moving behind her to fasten it around her neck. "No matter what happens." The reminder of the threat still hanging over them dimmed Abigail's joy momentarily, but she pushed the shadow away. "Tonight was for celebration, not fear. I have one more gift for you," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently against her abdomen, "though it won't arrive until summer." Patrick stared at her uncomprehendingly for a moment before understanding dawned in his eyes. "Abigail." He whispered, hope and wonder mingling in his voice. "Are you certain?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it when we were in town last week. I wanted to wait for the perfect moment to tell you." Patrick's face transformed with joy as he gathered her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "A baby," he marveled, setting her down gently. "Our baby." "Are you pleased?" Abigail asked, though his reaction had already answered the question. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it," Patrick said, kneeling to place a reverent kiss against her still flat stomach before looking up at her with shining eyes. "I love you, Abigail Irwin. You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible." Emma, sensing the excitement though not understanding its cause, crawled over to pat Patrick's knee with her tiny hand, the doll still clutched in her other fist. Patrick scooped her up, including her in their embrace. "And I love you, Miss Emma," he said, kissing the top of her head. "You're going to be a wonderful big sister." The perfect moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch house at speed. Patrick's expression hardened as he handed Emma to Abigail. "Stay here," he instructed, moving quickly to the gun cabinet and extracting his rifle. "Keep away from the windows." Abigail clutched Emma close, heart pounding as Patrick checked that the weapon was loaded before moving to the front door. Through the window, she could see lantern light approaching 3 riders moving swiftly up the drive. "Mr. Irwin." A voice called through the darkness. Message from town. Patrick relaxed slightly, recognizing the voice of young Billy Matthews, who worked at the livery stable in Piotch. He opened the door cautiously, rifle still ready. "What's the emergency, Billy?" he asked, eyeing the 3 riders Billy and 2 men Abigail didn't recognize. "These gentlemen arrived on the evening stage," Billy explained breathlessly. "Said they had urgent business with you that couldn't wait till morning, paid me good money to bring them out right away." Patrick's gaze shifted to the strangers, his stance wary. "State your business, gentlemen." One of the men, tall and expensively dressed despite the travel dust covering his clothes, stepped forward into the pool of light spilling from the open door. "Mr. Patrick Irwin?" he inquired formally. "That's right," Patrick confirmed, not lowering his rifle. The man reached slowly into his coat, producing an envelope. "I represent Charles Jensen of San Francisco. I'm here to discuss the return of his wife and child." Patrick's expression remained impassive. "My wife and daughter are inside, celebrating Christmas Eve. I don't know anything about Mr. Jensen's family." The man's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Jensen has reason to believe that Abigail Jensen and the infant Emma are residing here. He has authorized me to offer substantial compensation for their safe return." "As I said," Patrick repeated firmly, "my wife Abigail Irwin and our daughter Emma are inside. They are not available for return to anyone, compensated or otherwise." The second man stepped forward, his demeanor more aggressive. "Listen here, Irwin. Mr. Jensen is not a man to be trifled with. He knows his wife and child are here and he wants them back. The easy way or the hard way is up to you." Patrick's rifle came up smoothly, aimed at the second man's chest. "The easy way is that you both get back on your horses and ride out of here tonight. The hard way involves me defending my family from trespassers making threats on Christmas Eve." His voice was dangerously quiet. "Your choice, gentlemen." Billy Matthews shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly regretting his involvement in the confrontation. "Mr. Irwin, I didn't know." "It's all right, Billy," Patrick assured him without taking his eyes off the strangers. "You can head back to town now. These men will be leaving shortly." The first man studied Patrick for a long moment before nodding slightly. "We'll go for now, Mr. Irwin, but this matter is far from settled. Mr. Jensen is a determined man, especially where his family is concerned." "So am I," Patrick replied evenly. "And make sure you tell Mr. Jensen that Abigail and Emma are legally and rightfully my family now. Any attempt to change that will be met with the full force of the law and my personal response." The implied threat hung in the cold air between them. Finally, the first man tucked the envelope back into his coat. "We'll convey your message," he said stiffly. "Good evening, Mr. Irwin." Patrick watched silently as the men turned their horses and rode back down the drive, waiting until they were out of sight before lowering his rifle and returning inside. Abigail stood in the parlor doorway. Emma clutched protectively to her chest. "Charles's men," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Patrick nodded grimly, setting his rifle aside. "They've gone for now, but they'll be back. Jensen knows you're here and he knows we're married. What do we do?" Abigail asked, the joy of their earlier celebration completely overshadowed by renewed fear. Patrick crossed to her, enfolding both her and Emma in his embrace. "We celebrate Christmas," he said firmly. "We love each other, we prepare for our new baby. And we face whatever comes together as a family." Abigail nodded against his chest, drawing strength from his certainty. "As a family," she echoed, one hand curling protectively over her abdomen where their child was just beginning to grow. Whatever Charles planned, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them together. The woman who had hidden in a barn with her baby all those months ago was gone, replaced by Abigail Irwin, wife, mother and partner to a man who had promised them both would be fed before dawn, and had kept that promise in ways she could never have imagined. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the fresh snow glittering like diamonds in the sunlight. Despite the ominous visit the night before, Abigail was determined to make the day special for Emma's first Christmas. They exchanged the rest of their gifts, enjoyed a festive breakfast, and later welcomed the ranch hands for a holiday dinner that filled the house with warmth and laughter. If Patrick was concerned about Charles's next move, he hit it well, throwing himself into the celebrations with genuine enthusiasm. Only once, when he thought Abigail wasn't watching, did she catch him staring out the window with a troubled expression, scanning the horizon as if expecting unwelcome visitors. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed quietly. The ranch settled back into its winter routine, though Patrick increased the night patrols and sent one of the hands into town daily for news and mail. Abigail tried to focus on the joy of her pregnancy rather than the threat hanging over them, but anxiety gnawed at her constantly. 3 days into the new year of 1877, Patrick received a telegram that confirmed their fears. Charles Jensen had arrived in Piotch personally, taking rooms at the finest hotel in town. The confrontation they had been dreading was now imminent. "I'm going into town tomorrow," Patrick announced that evening as they sat before the fire after Emma was asleep. "I need to speak with Judge Wilson and Sheriff Taylor, make sure they're aware of the situation." "I should come with you," Abigail said, setting aside her mending. "Charles is here because of me. I should face him." Patrick shook his head firmly. "Not this time. In your condition, I don't want you anywhere near him." His hand reached out to cover hers protectively. "Let me handle this, Abigail, please." She wanted to argue but recognized the wisdom in his request. Confronting Charles while carrying Patrick's child would only inflame the situation further, and if Charles were to become violent, "Be careful," she said instead. "Charles is at his most dangerous when he feels challenged." "I'll be careful," Patrick promised, "but I need to make our position clear legally and personally. Jensen needs to understand that you and Emma are not his to reclaim." The next morning, Patrick left for town early, dressed in his best clothes and riding his fastest horse. Abigail spent the day alternating between prayer and practical preparations, checking that all doors and windows were secure, ensuring the rifle was loaded and accessible, keeping Emma close at all times. By mid-afternoon, with no word from Patrick, her anxiety had become nearly unbearable. She paced the parlor, watching the road through the window, starting at every sound from outside. Emma seemed to sense her distress, becoming fussy and clingy despite Abigail's attempts to maintain a calm demeanor. The sound of approaching riders finally came just before dusk. Abigail rushed to the window, relief flooding through her at the sight of Patrick's familiar figure leading several others up the drive. As they drew closer, she recognized Sheriff Taylor, Judge Wilson, and a third man whose elegant attire and rigid posture could only belong to Charles Jensen. Heart pounding, Abigail moved away from the window and seated herself in the parlor, Emma on her lap. She smoothed her dress, checked that her hair was neatly pinned, and took several deep breaths to calm her racing pulse. After years of fear and months of running, the moment of confrontation had arrived. The front door opened, Patrick's voice calling, "Abigail, we have visitors." "In the parlor," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the tumult inside her. Patrick entered first, his expression unreadable. Sheriff Taylor and Judge Wilson followed, both looking uncomfortable but determined. And then, filling the doorway with his commanding presence, came Charles. He looked exactly as Abigail remembered, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, dark hair perfectly styled, handsome features arranged in an expression of concern that never quite reached his cold eyes. Those eyes fixed on Abigail now, narrowing slightly as they took in her simple dress, her changed appearance, the child on her lap. "Abigail," Charles said, his cultured voice sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "You've led us on quite a chase, my dear." Before Abigail could respond, Patrick moved to stand beside her chair, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Mr. Jensen is here to discuss the situation civilly," he explained, his voice tight. "The judge and sheriff are present to ensure the conversation remains respectful." Charles's gaze flicked to Patrick's hand on Abigail's shoulder, a flash of anger crossing his features before his pleasant mask returned. "Indeed, I've agreed to hear Mr. Irwin's perspective before pursuing legal remedies." Please sit, Abigail said, gesturing to the chairs arranged across from her. She was surprised by her own composure in the face of the man who had terrorized her for years. Charles sat with perfect posture, declining Patrick's offer of refreshment with a dismissive wave. "I think we should dispense with pleasantries," he said coolly. "The situation is quite simple. My wife and child disappeared from our home in San Francisco. I've traced them here only to discover that Mrs. Jensen has engaged in the criminal act of bigamy by purporting to marry Mr. Irwin." He turned to Judge Wilson. "I assume the territory takes such crimes seriously, Your Honor." The judge cleared his throat. "Normally, yes. However, in this case, Mrs. Irwin filed for divorce from you on grounds of cruelty and threat to her child before formalizing her marriage to Mr. Irwin. Under territorial law, her marriage is valid." Charles's expression hardened. "Allegations of cruelty are easily made, Your Honor, and difficult to disprove. I assure you my wife was treated with nothing but consideration during our marriage." "Is that why she fled in the middle of the night with an infant?" Patrick asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Because of your consideration, my wife has always been of a nervous disposition," Charles replied smoothly. "The demands of motherhood overwhelmed her, I fear. She wasn't thinking clearly when she left." "I was thinking more clearly than I ever had before," Abigail said quietly, finding her voice at last. "I left because you threatened our daughter, Charles, because you came home drunk and said her crying was driving you mad. Because you grabbed her from her cradle and shook her until I thought her neck would break." Charles's pleasant expression slipped for a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. "Fabrications," he spat. "Delusions of a hysterical woman, Mrs. Irwin's account matches the sworn statement she gave me," Judge Wilson interjected, "as does her description of previous incidents of violence against her person. I have witnesses who will attest to Mrs. Irwin's bruises and injuries during her marriage to Mr. Jensen," Patrick added, his hand tightening slightly on Abigail's shoulder. "Including Dr. Morrison, who treated her upon her arrival in Piotch." Charles's gaze swept the room, calculating, "Even if these allegations were true, which I categorically deny, the law still grants a father rights to his child. Emma is my daughter and heir. I will not allow her to be raised by a rancher in this wilderness." Emma, hearing her name, looked up from the wooden blocks she had been stacking on Abigail's lap. Her curious gaze found Charles, studying him without recognition or interest before returning to her play. "She doesn't know you," Abigail observed quietly. "You never held her, never cared for her. You called her that squalling thing and complained that her existence interfered with our social obligations." "I am still her father," Charles insisted. "Blood cannot be erased by a few months' absence." "Being a father is more than blood, Mr. Jensen," Patrick said, moving to lift Emma gently from Abigail's lap. The baby went to him willingly, settling comfortably in his arms with the easy trust of a child who has never known anything but gentle handling from those hands. "It's love, protection, daily care. Emma knows who loves her." Charles watched this exchange with thinly veiled contempt. "How touching," he sneered. "The rancher playing father to another man's child. Tell me, Irwin, does it bother you to raise a cuckoo in your nest?" Sheriff Taylor shifted uncomfortably at the crude implication, but Patrick's expression remained calm. "Emma is my daughter in every way that matters," he replied evenly, "and her mother is my wife legally, morally, and by her own free choice." Charles turned back to Abigail, his voice hardening. "This fantasy you're playing at will end, Abigail. I have resources, connections. I can make life very difficult for your rancher. Come home with me now, bring Emma, and I'll be magnanimous enough to forgive this entire episode." "There's nothing to forgive, Charles," Abigail said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not your possession to reclaim. I'm not coming back to San Francisco, and neither is Emma." She rose from her chair, standing tall despite her trembling knees. "My home is here now. My family is here." Charles stood as well, his control finally slipping. "You think this is over? You think you can humiliate me like this and I'll simply walk away?" He took a step toward her, fury distorting his handsome features. "I will destroy this man and his pathetic ranch. I will take Emma." "I will, that's enough," Sheriff Taylor interrupted, moving between them. "Mr. Jensen, I believe it's time for you to return to town." Charles ignored him, his gaze fixed on Abigail. "You were mine first," he hissed. "You'll be mine again, one way or another." Patrick handed Emma to Abigail and moved toward Charles, his stance deceptively casual but his eyes hard. "Mr. Jensen," he said quietly, "there's something you should know before you leave." "And what might that be, rancher?" Charles spat. "Abigail is carrying my child," Patrick said simply. "Our son or daughter will be born this summer. Whatever claim you think you have on her or Emma, you should know that threatening a man's pregnant wife is the surest way to discover exactly how far he'll go to protect his family." The news struck Charles like a physical blow. He stared at Abigail, his gaze dropping to her abdomen where no sign of pregnancy was yet visible. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "You're lying," he said, but without conviction. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it last week," Judge Wilson offered mildly. "It's a matter of medical record." Charles seemed to deflate slightly, his perfect posture sagging as the implications sank in. Abigail carrying another man's child complicated his claims immeasurably. Even if he could somehow regain legal custody of Emma, Abigail was now irrevocably tied to Patrick Irwin through the child she carried. "This isn't over," Charles said finally, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, Mr. Jensen, it is," Sheriff Taylor said firmly. "Judge Wilson has reviewed all the documents and found Mrs. Irwin's divorce petition and subsequent marriage to be legal and binding. You have no claim here, and I strongly suggest you return to San Francisco before your behavior crosses from unpleasant to criminal." Charles looked from the sheriff to the judge, then to Patrick's implacable expression, and finally to Abigail, standing proudly with Emma in her arms. Whatever he saw there, perhaps the strength she had discovered in herself, perhaps the maternal protectiveness that would never allow him near Emma again, seemed to penetrate his anger at last. "Very well," he said stiffly. "I'll depart for San Francisco tomorrow. But don't imagine this ends here, Abigail. There will be consequences for your actions." "The only consequence," Abigail replied calmly, "is that Emma and I are finally free of your control and cruelty. Go home, Charles, build a new life. We've already built ours." Without another word, Charles turned and strode from the room, his footsteps echoing through the house as Sheriff Taylor followed him out. Judge Wilson lingered, watching from the window until Charles and the sheriff had mounted their horses and ridden down the drive. "He'll likely file challenges in California courts," the judge warned, turning back to Patrick and Abigail. "But your position here is secure. Nevada territory won't recognize any claims he makes, especially with the documentation we've established." "Thank you, Judge," Patrick said, shaking the older man's hand, "for everything." After the judge departed, Abigail sank into her chair, her legs finally giving out as reaction set in. Patrick knelt before her, taking both her and Emma in his arms. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "He's gone and he won't be back." "You don't know Charles," Abigail whispered. "He doesn't accept defeat easily." "Perhaps not," Patrick acknowledged, "but he's a pragmatic man at heart. Once the shock fades, he'll recognize that pursuing this further only risks his reputation and business interests." He pulled back slightly to meet her eyes. "And even if he doesn't, we'll face it together, always together." Abigail nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. "Together," she agreed, resting her head against his shoulder as Emma nestled between them, oblivious to the confrontation that had just determined her future. That night, after Emma was asleep, Patrick and Abigail sat on the porch despite the winter chill, wrapped in blankets in each other's arms as they gazed at the star-filled sky above the ranch. "Are you truly all right?" Patrick asked, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I am," Abigail replied, surprised to discover it was true. Seeing Charles again was terrifying but also liberating. "For so long he was this overwhelming presence in my nightmares, but today he seemed smaller somehow, less powerful." "Because you're stronger now," Patrick suggested, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You stood your ground, you spoke your truth." "We stood our ground," Abigail corrected, snuggling closer against his warmth. I couldn't have faced him without knowing you were beside me. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, distant cattle lowing, the creak of the windmill, the soft whicker of horses in the stable. What do you think it will be? Patrick asked eventually, his hand moving to rest gently on Abigail's stomach. The baby, a boy, Abigail said with surprising certainty, strong and kind like his father. Patrick smiled against her hair. I was thinking a girl, clever and brave like her mother. We'll find out in summer, Abigail said, covering his hand with her own. Either way, he or she will be loved, so loved. Just like their mother, Patrick murmured, turning her face gently toward his for a kiss that carried all the promise of their shared future, a future built not on fear or control, but on trust, respect, and love that had begun one cold October night when a desperate woman with a baby had found shelter in a stranger's barn. The months that followed saw winter's grip slowly loosen on the Nevada landscape. As snow melted and the first green shoots appeared, Abigail's body changed too, her slender frame gradually rounding with the new life growing within. Patrick watched these changes with undisguised wonder, his hands gentle on her expanding belly as they lay together at night, feeling the first fluttering movements of their child. Emma thrived in the peaceful environment, taking her first real steps as spring arrived, chasing the barn cats with squealing delight, developing a vocabulary that grew daily. She called Patrick Papa without prompting, the word bringing tears to his eyes the first time she said it. To Abigail's joy, Emma showed no lasting effects from the traumatic start to her life. She was happy, secure, and deeply loved. True to Judge Wilson's prediction, legal notices arrived from California throughout the spring. Charles's attempts to challenge the divorce, the remarriage, the custody arrangements. Each document was met with firm responses from their lawyer in Piotch, each challenge ultimately failing against the solid legal foundation they had established. By May, the challenges had ceased entirely. Whether Charles had finally accepted defeat or simply determined that further pursuit wasn't worth the cost, they couldn't know. What mattered was that the shadow over their happiness had finally lifted. As Abigail's pregnancy progressed, her bond with Patrick deepened in ways she hadn't imagined possible. His tenderness toward her, his excitement about their child, his patience with her physical limitations as the baby grew larger all confirmed what her heart already knew. She had found not just safety in this marriage, but genuine love. Summer arrived hot and dry, turning the ranch lands golden beneath the relentless Nevada sun. Abigail's due date approached, bringing both excitement and apprehension. Dr. Morrison visited weekly, pronouncing her healthy but advising rest in the final weeks as the heat made her ankles swell and her back ache persistently. Patrick was attentive to the point of hovering, arranging for additional help with household tasks, insisting Abigail nap daily, reading every medical text he could find about childbirth. His earnest dedication made Abigail laugh even as it touched her deeply. "The baby and I are fine," she assured him one evening as he arranged pillows behind her back for the third time. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "I know," Patrick acknowledged, looking slightly abashed. "I just want everything to be perfect for you both." "It already is," Abigail said softly, drawing him down for a kiss. "We have everything we need each other." 3 nights later, Abigail woke to the unmistakable sensation of her waters breaking. Labor progressed too quickly for Dr. Morrison to arrive from town. Patrick sent a ranch hand galloping for the doctor, while Mrs. Hollister, summoned from her nearby home, took charge of the birthing room with practiced efficiency. "First babies often take their time, Mrs. Hollister observed, helping Abigail through contractions that were already coming fast and strong. "But this little one seems eager to meet the world." Patrick refused to leave Abigail's side despite Mrs. Hollister's initial protests. He held her hand through each contraction, wiped her brow, murmured encouragement when pain threatened to overwhelm her. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her as the final stage approached. "You can do this, Abigail. Bring our child into the world." With a final, tremendous effort, Abigail did exactly that. Their son arrived with a lusty cry just before dawn, pink and perfect, with a thatch of dark hair like his father's and eyes that, when they briefly opened, showed hints of Abigail's clear blue. "A boy," Patrick whispered in wonder as Mrs. Hollister placed the swaddled infant in Abigail's arms. "You were right." "Hello, Samuel," Abigail murmured, touching the baby's tiny fingers with gentle reverence. They had chosen the name months ago, Samuel Patrick Irwin, honoring both Patrick's father and himself. "He's beautiful," Patrick said, his voice thick with emotion as he perched carefully on the edge of the bed, one arm around Abigail's shoulders, the other hand gently stroking his son's cheek. "Perfect, doctor." Morrison arrived an hour later, pronouncing both mother and baby healthy after a thorough examination. Emma, brought in to meet her brother once the birthing room was tidied, approached the baby with solemn curiosity that soon gave way to delighted cooing as Samuel grasped her offered finger. "Baby," she declared, her vocabulary now including dozens of words. "My baby." "Your brother," Patrick corrected gently. "You'll help Mama and Papa take care of him, won't you?" Emma nodded with the serious determination of a not quite 2-year-old given an important task. "I help," she promised. Looking at her family gathered around her, Patrick's proud smile, Emma's curious excitement, Samuel's peaceful newborn face, Abigail felt a completeness she had never expected to find in this life. The journey from frightened runaway to beloved wife and mother had been neither easy nor straightforward, but each step, each challenge, had led to this moment of perfect belonging. That evening, after Emma was asleep in her bed and Samuel dozed in the cradle Patrick had crafted with his own hands, Abigail sat in the rocking chair by the nursery window. The summer twilight painted the ranch in soft gold, the familiar landscape stretching toward distant mountains that now represented not barriers, but boundaries of the home she had found. Patrick entered quietly, crossing to stand behind her chair. His hands came to rest gently on her shoulders, thumbs massaging the lingering tension from her muscles. "Happy?" he asked softly, just as he had on their wedding day. Abigail tilted her head back to look up at him, at the face that had become so dear to her. "More than I knew was possible," she answered truthfully. Patrick bent to kiss her, a gentle meeting of lips that contained all the tenderness of their shared journey. When he straightened, his gaze moved to their sleeping son, then back to Abigail with an expression of such love it made her heart ache with fullness. "I was thinking," he said, moving to sit on the nearby ottoman, taking her hands in his. "When Samuel is a bit older and you're feeling strong again, perhaps we might make a trip east to visit my sister Mary. She's been asking to meet you and the children in her letters." "I'd like that," Abigail said, touched by his consideration in waiting until after Samuel's birth to suggest travel. "I've never been east of the Mississippi." "And perhaps afterward," Patrick continued, a hint of nervousness in his voice, "we might consider expanding the ranch operations. The Morrison property adjacent to our east boundary is available. It would nearly double our grazing land." Abigail squeezed his hands encouragingly. "If you think it's a sound investment, I trust your judgment." "The thing is," Patrick explained, "with more land, we'd need to build a larger home eventually, something with more rooms for future additions to the family, if you wanted that someday." The tentative hope in his voice made Abigail smile. "More children," she clarified. Patrick nodded, a flush coloring his cheeks. "I grew up with siblings all around. It was chaotic sometimes, but there was always someone to talk to play with, to share the work. I'd like Emma and Samuel to have that too." He paused, adding quickly, "but only if you want it as well. Your health and happiness come first, always." Abigail leaned forward, touching his face gently. "I'd love more children with you, Patrick, a house full of them if we're so blessed." His answering smile was radiant. "I love you, Abigail Irwin," he said simply. "And I love you," she replied, the words coming as naturally as breath, "for feeding us before dawn and every day since." Over the years that followed, the Irwin Ranch prospered and grew, as did the family that called it home. Emma and Samuel were joined by three more siblings, twin girls, Charlotte and Julia, born 2 years after Samuel, and another boy, Thomas, 3 years after the twins. The small ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Patrick adding rooms and modernizing as their means allowed. Abigail's skillful management of the ranch's finances ensured that each expansion was done without endangering their security, each improvement enhancing both the property's value and their quality of life. Emma grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and her father's steady determination. Though Patrick was not her biological father, no one seeing them together could doubt the bond between them. He had been the only father she had ever known, and his love for his firstborn was unwavering. Samuel, as predicted, inherited Patrick's strength and kind heart, working alongside his father from an early age and showing a natural affinity for the ranch operations. The twins developed distinct personalities despite their identical appearance: Charlotte practical and businesslike, Julia dreamy and artistic. Young Thomas combined his mother's quick intelligence with his father's easygoing nature, becoming the family peacemaker. Abigail watched her children grow with a sense of wonder and gratitude. Each milestone, each small triumph and inevitable setback, reminded her of how close she had come to a very different life, one of fear and control, rather than love and freedom. Charles Jensen never returned to Piotch, though occasionally news of him reached them through business contacts. He had remarried, they heard, to a young socialite from a prominent San Francisco family. Whether he had changed his ways or simply found a more compliant wife, Abigail could not know. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she could think of him now without fear, even with a measure of pity for a man who had never understood that love could not be commanded or controlled, only given freely. On the 20th anniversary of the night Abigail had sought shelter in Patrick's barn, they hosted a celebration at the ranch, now one of the largest and most prosperous in the region. Friends and neighbors gathered to toast their success and happiness, many recalling with smiles how the community had initially raised eyebrows at the hasty marriage of the bachelor rancher to the mysterious young mother. They thought it wouldn't last 6 months, old Mrs. Hollister reminisced, patting Abigail's hand affectionately, said it was too sudden, too convenient, shows what they knew. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the younger children were abed, Abigail and Patrick stood on the porch of their home, looking out over the ranch illuminated by a full moon remarkably similar to the one that had shone on the night they first met. 20 years, Patrick marveled, his arm around Abigail's waist. His hair was silver at the temples now, lines of laughter etched around his eyes, but the strength and kindness that had first drawn her to him remained unchanged. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you and Emma hiding in the barn. And sometimes it feels like another lifetime, Abigail replied, leaning into his embrace. At 45, she retained the grace and beauty that had captured Patrick's heart, though childbearing and the Nevada sun had left their marks on her body. "You ever wonder," Patrick asked, "what might have happened if you'd chosen a different barn that night? Or if I'd been less insistent about feeding you before dawn?" Abigail smiled at the memory. "I've thought about it," she admitted, "but I've come to believe that some things are meant to be, however unlikely the path. We were meant to find each other, to build this life together." Patrick turned her gently in his arms to face him. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply. "Bringing you and Emma home that night. Best decision I ever made was staying," Abigail countered, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "Trusting you, loving you." Their kiss, after 20 years of marriage, still held the tenderness of that first tentative embrace on their wedding night, but now deepened by 2 decades of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges weathered together. From inside the house came the sound of Emma's laughter, now 21 and recently engaged to the son of a neighboring rancher. The young couple were discussing wedding plans with Samuel, whose own courtship of the schoolteacher's daughter was progressing steadily toward an engagement. "We should go in," Abigail said reluctantly, drawing back from Patrick's embrace. Before the children scandalized themselves with the sight of their elderly parents kissing on the porch, Patrick laughed, the sound as warm and genuine as it had been when she first heard it. "Let them be scandalized," he declared, pulling her close once more. "They should know that love doesn't fade with time, it grows stronger, deeper." "Like roots," Abigail agreed, thinking of the massive oak they had planted when Samuel was born, now stretching high above the ranch house, providing shade and shelter for the generations that would follow. Hand in hand, they turned back toward the house where their family waited, the family born of a desperate flight, a chance encounter, and a simple act of kindness on a cold October night when a cowboy had promised a frightened woman and her baby that they would be fed before dawn. That promise, like so many Patrick had made in the years since, had been kept not just with food for their bodies, but with love for their hearts, security for their minds, and a home for their souls. It was a legacy that would endure long after they were gone, passed down through children and grandchildren who would know that love, given freely and without condition, was the greatest gift anyone could offer or receive. And for Abigail, who had once hidden in a barn with nothing but her baby and her courage, it was the fulfillment of a dream she had scarcely dared to imagine, a life defined not by fear, but by boundless, enduring love.